Hey, if you want to hear this incredible story, don't you dare click away. When you hear the ending, you're going to be shocked. If you love horses, this is a miraculous story told in a calm and heartfelt way. When the children at Broken Ridge Elementary School gathered in the arena that April afternoon to meet the new therapy horse, they had no idea they were about to witness something miraculous. The gray stallion stood calmly in the center of the ring, his silver coat gleaming in the spring sunlight. And when 8-year-old Emma Chen, who hadn't spoken a word since her parents' accident 6 months earlier, reached up to touch his neck, the horse did something no one had heard him do in over a year. He nickered, soft, gentle, and unmistakably real. But to understand how this silent stallion became the voice for voiceless children, we need to go back to a freezing November morning when ranch foreman Marcus Webb made a discovery in an abandoned barn that would change everything he thought he knew about pain, healing, and the unbreakable bonds between broken souls. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe for more heartwarming rescue stories. The frost clung to every surface like a second skin on that November morning, transforming the remote Wyoming landscape into something from a winter fairy tale. Marcus Webb pulled his worn Carhartt jacket tighter against the biting wind as he made his way across the frozen ground toward the old Miller property. At 42, Marcus had spent more than half his life working ranches across the Mountain West, and his weathered face and calloused hands told the story of countless early mornings and hard-won lessons about the land and the animals that depended on it. The Miller place had been abandoned for nearly 3 years, ever since old Gerald Miller passed away and his children, scattered across the country in their city lives, had decided the remote Wyoming ranch wasn't worth the trouble of maintaining. The property had slowly returned to wilderness, with buildings sagging under the weight of neglect and fences collapsing into tangles of wire and rotting wood. Marcus only checked on. The Miller place had been abandoned for nearly 3 years, ever since old Gerald Miller passed away and his children, scattered across the country in their city lives, had decided the remote Wyoming ranch wasn't worth the trouble of maintaining. The property had slowly returned to wilderness, with buildings sagging under the weight of neglect and fences collapsing into tangles of wire and rotting wood. Marcus only checked on the place because it bordered the northern edge of the Clearwater Ranch where he worked, and his boss, Catherine Reynolds, believed in being a good neighbor even to empty land. As Marcus approached the main barn, a structure that had once been painted red but now showed more gray wood than color, he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The barn door, which had been secured with a rusted chain the last time he checked 2 weeks ago, now stood slightly ajar. Fresh marks in the frost around the entrance suggested something large had forced its way inside recently, probably within the last few hours. Marcus's first thought was cattle. Sometimes range cows would break through old fences seeking shelter from the harsh weather. But as he pulled the barn door open wider, the metallic screech of hinges breaking the morning silence, what he saw inside made his breath catch in his throat. Standing in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the barn walls, was a horse. But not just any horse. This was a magnificent gray stallion, easily 17 hands tall, with a coat that seemed to capture and reflect what little light reached into the barn's interior. The horse stood perfectly still, watching Marcus with dark, intelligent eyes that held a depth of awareness that was almost unsettling. Marcus had been around horses his entire life. He knew their language, their moods, the subtle signals they gave about their intentions and emotions. He knew that when you approached an unfamiliar horse, especially one that might be frightened or defensive, you should expect some kind of reaction. A warning nicker, a stamping hoof, a toss of the head, ears pinned back in warning, or a sidestep away from the stranger. This horse did none of those things. He simply stood there, silent and motionless, and that silence was what made Marcus's skin prickle with unease. "Easy, boy," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying in the empty barn. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Just want to see if you're okay." The stallion's ears flickered forward at the sound of Marcus's voice, tracking the man's movements as he took a slow step forward. But still, the horse made no sound. Marcus could see the animal's sides moving with each breath, could see the slight tension in the powerful muscles beneath that silver-gray coat, but there was no accompanying sound. No blow of breath through nostrils, no soft nicker of greeting or warning, nothing. As Marcus drew closer, moving with the careful patience of someone who'd learned that hurrying around horses was a good way to get hurt, he began to notice details that filled him with a cold, creeping anger. The stallion's ribs were visible beneath his coat, not terribly emaciated, but clearly underfed for an animal of his size. There were old scars across his flanks, the kind that came from rope burns and rough handling. But it was when Marcus circled around to see the horse's head more clearly that he felt his stomach turn. The stallion's muzzle bore the unmistakable marks of having been tightly bound, probably with wire or rough rope. The scars formed a pattern around his mouth and nose, and when Marcus looked more closely at the horse's throat, he could see subtle signs of old trauma there as well. Someone hadn't just neglected this animal. Someone had deliberately tried to silence him. Marcus had heard stories about such things during his years working ranches. Cruel owners who would bind a horse's mouth shut to keep them from making noise, sometimes as punishment, sometimes out of some twisted belief that a quiet horse was more valuable. The practice was barbaric and, thankfully, rare. But looking at this magnificent stallion with his scarred muzzle and haunted eyes, Marcus knew he was looking at a victim of exactly that kind of cruelty. "What did they do to you, boy?" Marcus whispered, more to himself than to the horse. The stallion's ears flickered again, but no sound emerged. The silence was absolute and terrible. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes in that barn, moving slowly around the horse, talking in a low, steady voice, letting the animal become accustomed to his presence. He could see that despite everything, despite the scars and the fear and whatever trauma had brought him to this state, the stallion had not given up. There was still spirit in those dark eyes, still strength in that powerful frame. This was a survivor. The practical part of Marcus's mind was already working through the logistics. He needed to get this horse back to Clearwater Ranch where he could be properly cared for, examined by a veterinarian, and given the treatment he clearly needed. But moving a traumatized horse, especially one this size and potentially unpredictable, required careful planning. Marcus pulled out his cell phone, grateful that the Miller property sat on just enough of a hill to catch a weak signal. He called his boss, Catherine Reynolds, and explained the situation. Catherine, who had inherited Clearwater Ranch from her father and run it with a combination of business acumen and genuine love for the land and animals, didn't hesitate. "Bring him in," she said simply. "Whatever he needs, we'll figure it out. I'll call Dr. Morrison and have her meet you at the ranch." It took Marcus another 2 hours to rig up a makeshift lead rope and convince the stallion to walk out of that barn and make the slow journey across the frozen landscape to Clearwater Ranch. The horse moved with a kind of ghost-like silence that was eerie to witness. Even his hoofbeats seemed muffled, as if the animal had learned to move through the world without leaving any auditory trace of his existence. Dr. Sarah Morrison arrived at Clearwater Ranch within an hour of Marcus bringing the stallion into the barn. Sarah was one of the few large animal veterinarians serving the remote ranches of western Wyoming, and in her 15 years of practice, she had seen just about every kind of injury, neglect, and abuse that animals could suffer. But when she examined the gray stallion, even her professional composure cracked. "This is deliberate trauma," she told Marcus and Catherine as she carefully examined the horse's throat and muzzle. "Someone systematically damaged his vocal structures. The scarring around his larynx suggests repeated injury, probably from having his mouth and throat bound tightly for extended periods. It's a miracle he can breathe normally, let alone that he's alive at all." "Can you fix it?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer from the expression on Sarah's face. "The physical damage? Some of it, maybe. But Marcus, this kind of trauma isn't just physical. This horse has been conditioned to be silent. Even if his vocal cords could work normally, he might never use them again. The psychological damage from this kind of systematic abuse." She trailed off, shaking her head. Over the next several weeks, as autumn gave way to the brutal cold of a Wyoming winter, the gray stallion became a fixture at Clearwater Ranch. Marcus took personal responsibility for his care, spending hours each day in the horse's stall, talking to him, grooming him, slowly building the foundation of trust that had been so thoroughly destroyed by whoever had owned him before. The other horses at the ranch noticed the newcomer, of course. They would call to him across the pasture, their whinnies and nickering carrying across the cold air. But the gray stallion never answered. He would watch the other horses with what seemed like longing, his ears forward and his attention focused, but no sound ever escaped him. The other ranch hands started calling him Ghost, both F. Marcus tried everything he could think of to coax some kind of vocalization from Ghost. He brought the stallion's favorite treats, carrots and apples that Ghost would accept with gentle lips but silent gratitude. He introduced Ghost to the other horses slowly, hoping that natural herd behavior might override whatever conditioning had silenced him. He even played recordings of horse sounds, trying to trigger some kind of instinctive response. Nothing worked. Ghost remained silent, a beautiful, powerful, utterly voiceless presence in the Clearwater barn. It was Catherine who first suggested that Ghost might have a different kind of purpose. It happened on a December afternoon when her niece, a 7-year-old named Riley who had autism and struggled with verbal communication, came to visit the ranch. Riley was fascinated by the horses but often became overwhelmed by the noise and chaos of the barn, the neighing, the stamping, the constant motion and sound. But when Riley met Ghost, something changed. The silent stallion stood perfectly still in his stall as the little girl approached. He lowered his head to her level, his dark eyes gentle and patient. Riley, who rarely looked people in the eye and usually shied away from physical contact, reached out and placed her small hand on Ghost's nose. The two of them stood like that for a long moment, perfectly still, perfectly silent, communicating in a language that had nothing to do with words. "He doesn't make noise," Riley said softly, and it was one of the longest sentences she'd spoken in weeks. "He's like me. Sometimes I can't make words either." Catherine looked at Marcus, and in that moment, they both saw the same possibility. Ghost might never be a working ranch horse, might never be able to call to his herd or whinny for his dinner. But perhaps his silence, his unique way of existing in the world, could be exactly what some people needed. The idea of turning Ghost into a therapy horse took root slowly but steadily. CA? The research on equine-assisted therapy is quite compelling, Dr. Lawson explained when she visited Clearwater Ranch to assess Ghost's potential. Horses are naturally therapeutic animals. They're empathetic, they respond to emotional states, and they offer unconditional acceptance. But a silent horse? That's unique. For children who struggle with verbal communication, whether from trauma or developmental differences, a horse who exists so peacefully, without sound, could be incredibly powerful. The certification process to become an official therapy animal was extensive. Ghost had to demonstrate that he was calm, patient, and reliable around children. He had to show that he wouldn't spook easily, that he could tolerate unexpected touches or loud noises without reacting dangerously. For a horse who had been so severely traumatized, these were tall orders. But Ghost proved himself again and again. It was as if, having lost his voice, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to communicate through presence and patience alone. Children who met him seemed to instinctively understand that this was a safe space, a being who wouldn't demand anything from them, who would simply exist alongside them with calm acceptance. By February, Ghost had completed his therapy certification. Catherine, working with Dr. Lawson, developed a program called Silent Voices that would bring children to Clearwater Ranch for equine-assisted therapy sessions. The first group of participants was scheduled for early April, and among them was 8-year-old Emma Chen. Emma's story was the kind that broke hearts. 6 months earlier, her parents had been killed in a car accident on an icy mountain road. Emma, who had been in the car but survived with only minor physical injuries, had not spoken a single word since the accident. She had withdrawn into herself, communicating only through nods and head shakes, refusing all attempts by therapists, teachers, and her grief-stricken grandparents to DR. The day Emma came to Clearwater Ranch, a warm April day that hinted at the spring that was slowly pushing winter out of the high country, the arena had been set up carefully. A small group of chairs for observers sat to one side. The other children in the therapy program were there with their parents and caregivers, all curious about this silent therapy horse they'd heard about. Marcus led Ghost into the arena, and the big stallion moved with his characteristic silent grace. His silver coat had grown thick over the winter and gleamed in the spring sunlight. He looked magnificent and somehow otherworldly, like a horse from a legend rather than a creature of flesh and blood. Emma, tiny and dark-haired, stood beside her grandmother at the edge of the arena. She watched Ghost with the same guarded expression she wore for everything and everyone these days, a look that said she had seen too much pain for someone so young and wasn't about to let anyone or anything close enough to hurt her again. Dr. Lawson knelt beside Emma and spoke softly to her. "This is Ghost. He's a very special horse. Would you like to meet him?" Emma didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. Dr. Lawson stood and gently guided Emma toward the center of the arena where Marcus stood with Ghost. The other children and their families watched in silent anticipation. As Emma approached, Ghost did what he had done with every child he'd met. He stood perfectly still and lowered his head to the child's level. His dark eyes were gentle and patient, radiating a kind of calm acceptance that seemed to fill the space around him. Emma stopped a few feet away, studying the horse with serious, careful eyes. Marcus could see her taking in every detail. The scars on Ghost's muzzle, the gentle way he held himself, the utter silence that surrounded him like an invisible cloak. The day Emma came to Clearwater Ranch, a warm April day that hinted at the spring that was slowly pushing winter out of the high country, the arena had been set up carefully. A small group of chairs for observers sat to one side. The other children in the therapy program were there with their parents and caregivers, all curious about this silent therapy horse they'd heard about. Marcus led Ghost into the arena, and the big stallion moved with his characteristic silent grace. His silver coat had grown thick over the winter and gleamed in the spring sunlight. He looked magnificent and somehow otherworldly, like a horse from a legend rather than a creature of flesh and blood. Emma, tiny and dark-haired, stood beside her grandmother at the edge of the arena. She watched Ghost with the same guarded expression she wore for everything and everyone these days, a look that said she had seen too much pain for someone so young and wasn't about to let anyone or anything close enough to hurt her again. Dr. Lawson knelt beside Emma and spoke softly to her. "This is Ghost. He's a very special horse. Would you like to meet him?" Emma didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. Dr. Lawson stood and gently guided Emma toward the center of the arena where Marcus stood with Ghost. The other children and their families watched in silent anticipation. As Emma approached, Ghost did what he had done with every child he'd met. He stood perfectly still and lowered his head to the child's level. His dark eyes were gentle and patient, radiating a kind of calm acceptance that seemed to fill the space around him. Emma stopped a few feet away, studying the horse with serious, careful eyes. Marcus could see her taking in every detail. The scars on Ghost's muzzle, the gentle way he held himself, the utter silence that surrounded him like an invisible cloak. "He doesn't talk," Emma's grandmother whispered, her voice choked with emotion at hearing her granddaughter speak for the first time in half a year. "He can't," Dr. Lawson said gently. "Someone hurt him a long time ago, and now he can't make sounds like other horses do." Emma took a step closer to Ghost, then another. She reached out her small hand, hesitating for just a moment before placing it on Ghost's neck. The horse didn't move, didn't react except for a slight softening in his eyes. For a long moment, girl and horse stood together in perfect, profound silence. Then Emma did something that made every adult in the arena hold their breath. She leaned forward and whispered something directly into Ghost's ear, words too soft for anyone else to hear. And in that moment, Ghost did something he hadn't done in over a year. He nickered. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the strong, clear vocalization of a healthy horse. It was rough and soft and almost hesitant, as if Ghost himself was surprised that sound had emerged from his damaged throat. But it was unmistakably real, unmistakably a horse's voice speaking after so long in silence. Emma pulled back slightly, her eyes wide with wonder. And then, for the first time since the accident that had taken her parents, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. "He talked," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I told him it was okay to be scared and sad. I told him I was scared and sad too. And he talked back." Marcus felt tears spring to his eyes, and he wasn't alone. Emma's grandmother was openly crying, and even Dr. Lawson had to wipe at her eyes. Catherine stood at the edge of the arena with her hand over her mouth, watching this miraculous moment unfold. But the real miracle wasn't just that Ghost had finally found his voice again, or that Emma had broken her silence. The miracle was in the connection between them. Two beings who had both lost their voices to trauma, who had both been forced into silence by pain they couldn't control, finding each other and in that finding, discovering that healing was possible. In the weeks and months that followed, Emma became a regular visitor to Clearwater Ranch. She and Ghost developed a bond that went beyond the typical therapy-animal relationship. They were kindred spirits, survivors who understood each other's pain in ways that words could never fully capture. Emma's speech returned gradually, haltingly at first, but gaining strength and confidence as her therapy sessions with Ghost continued. And Ghost, he never became a loud horse. His voice, when he used it, remained soft and infrequent. But he no longer lived in absolute silence. He would nicker softly to Emma when she arrived at the ranch. He would call out occasionally to the other horses in the pasture. He had found his voice again, and in doing so, he had helped a little girl find hers. The Silent Voices program grew beyond anything Catherine and Dr. Lawson had initially imagined. Children came from across Wyoming and neighboring states to meet the therapy horse who understood what it meant to lose your voice and slowly, painfully, find it again. Some of these children had experienced abuse. Some had witnessed violence. Some simply processed the world differently and struggled to express themselves in traditional ways. All of them found something in Ghost that helped them on their healing journey. Marcus continued to be Ghost's primary caretaker, and the bond between man and horse deepened with each passing season. Marcus had saved Ghost's life that cold November morning. But in truth, Ghost had saved something in Marcus too, had reminded him that even the most broken things can heal, that silence doesn't have to be permanent, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that have learned to speak after being silenced. On warm summer evenings, Marcus would often sit on the fence rail watching Ghost graze in the pasture with the other horses. The big gray stallion was no longer the silent Ghost he had been when Marcus first found him. He was part of the herd now, connected to the other horses through the complex social bonds that made horse society work. He would nicker to his friends, call out warnings when something startled him, and even engage in the playful horse conversations that happened around feeding time. But there was still something special about Ghost, something that set him apart. Maybe it was the scars he bore, both visible and invisible. Maybe it was the journey he had made from that dark barn to this sun-drenched pasture. Or maybe it was simply that he had learned, through the hardest possible lessons, that voice is precious, that communication is a gift, and that connection with others is worth the vulnerability it requires. Emma Chen visited the ranch almost every weekend through that spring and summer. Her therapy sessions with Ghost officially ended after 6 months, but the friendship between the girl and the horse continued. She would help Marcus with basic care tasks, filling water buckets, brushing Ghost's coat, picking out his hooves. She would sit in his stall and read to him, her young voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing week. One August afternoon, as Emma sat on the fence rail watching Ghost roll in the dirt with obvious pleasure, a behavior that Dr. Morrison said indicated a horse feeling safe and content, she turned to Marcus with a serious expression. "Do you think Ghost remembers?" she asked. "Remembers when he couldn't talk?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think he probably does. Those kinds of memories don't just go away. But I also think he's learned that what happened to him doesn't have to define who he is. He's more than his scars, more than his trauma. He's Ghost, and he's pretty special." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I remember too, when I couldn't talk after my mom and dad died. Sometimes I'm scared it will happen again, that one day the words will just stop coming." "That's natural to be afraid of," Marcus said gently. "But you know what? Even if the words did stop for a while, it wouldn't mean they were gone forever. You found your voice again, just like Ghost did. And even in the silence, you were still you, still Emma, still someone special and valuable." The little girl smiled, and there was a wisdom in that smile that seemed far beyond her years. "Ghost taught me that," she said. "That being quiet doesn't mean you don't have anything to say. Sometimes it just means you're finding the right way to say it." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming high country, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Ghost ambled over to the fence where Emma and Marcus sat. He pushed his nose against Emma's shoulder in the gentle way that had become his signature greeting, and she reached up to stroke his face, carefully avoiding the scars that still marked his muzzle. "Good boy, Ghost," she said softly. And in response, the big gray stallion nickered, soft, gentle, and full of contentment. It was a simple sound, one that horses make 100 times a day. But for those who knew Ghost's story, who understood the journey he had made from silence to voice. It was nothing, sh.